We remember World War II for the grit of the soldiers on the beaches and the pilots in the sky. But the war was truly won by quiet men in drafty labs, men the Nazis laughed at, until it was tragically too late. In 1944, the Messerschmitt Me-2062 jet was the most advanced weapon on Earth, and it should have won the war for Germany. It didn't because of a quiet British scientist they had dismissed as irrelevant years earlier. The Nazi leadership believed electronic warfare was Jewish physics and mocked it. That arrogance cost them everything when a secret radar prototype started shooting their invincible jets out of the sky long before the pilots even knew they were in danger. It's one of the great untold stories of the Second World War. We see the films of the dogfights, the tanks, the ships, but underneath all of it, unseen, was a different kind of war. A war of radio waves, of calculations, of strange new boxes that could see in the dark. Winston Churchill had a name for it. He called it the Wizard War. And the man who started it all wasn't a general or a politician. He was a quiet, spectacled-wearing chemist named Henry Tizard. This is the story of how that quiet man, armed with a radical idea, saved his country, and how the very arrogance of the enemy became their own undoing. To understand how high the stakes were, you have to picture Britain in the early 1930s. It was a different world. The memory of the Great War was still a fresh scar, and across the Channel, something dark was rising in Germany. The new Nazi government wasn't just building an army, they were building an air force, the Luftwaffe, unlike anything the world had ever seen. In London, the thinking was bleak. The Prime Minister, at the time, Stanley Baldwin, said it plainly: "The bomber will always get through." It was a statement of terror. It meant there was no defense. It meant cities would burn. It meant the next war would be over before it even began. The Air Ministry was desperate. They put out a call, almost a fantasy, for a new kind of weapon. They wanted a death ray, a beam that could stop a pilot's heart or boil his blood from miles away. It sounded like something out of a Buck Rogers comic strip, and most serious scientists in London scoffed. But the government was so desperate, they offered a prize of £1,000 to anyone who could build one. This is where our man, Henry Tizard, enters the story. Tizard was not a dreamer. He was a practical man, a chemist, a pilot himself, and above all, a patriot. He was the head of the Aeronautical Research Committee. He heard the talk of death rays, and he did what a good scientist does. He did the math. He calculated the sheer energy required to project a beam that could harm a man miles away. The power, he found, would be immense, far beyond anything they could generate. The death ray, he concluded, was a fantasy. But Tizard was haunted by Baldwin's words, "The bomber will always get through." If we can't stop the bomber, he thought, could we at least see it coming? That simple question would change the world. It was 1934. Tizard formed a small, secret committee. His job was to find real, practical ways to defend Britain from the air. He brought in a few brilliant minds, including a physicist named Robert Watson Watt. Tizard posed his question to him. Forget the death ray. What about detection? Watson Watt was a radio man. He worked for the National Weather Service, studying thunderstorms. He knew that radio waves bounced off things. He'd seen it happen. He wrote a quick memo to Tizard. He said a wraith ray was unpromising, but using radio waves for detection, that might just work. Tizard seized on it. He didn't want theory. He wanted proof. He arranged a test. It was one of the most important experiments of the 20th century, and it was done on the cheap, in secret, with borrowed equipment. They called it the Daventry Experiment, On a cold day in February 1935, Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins set up a simple receiver in a field in Northamptonshire. They didn't have a powerful transmitter of their own, so they used the BBC's own broadcast antenna at Daventry. They aimed their receiver at the sky, waiting. The test subject was a Royal Air Force Hayford bomber. The pilot was ordered to fly a specific path near the antenna. Wilkins sat in the back of a van, his eye glued to a small screen, a cathode ray oscilloscope. He was looking for a blip. The bomber approached, and then it happened. A small green line on the screen jumped. It flickered, growing and shrinking as the plane moved. The radio waves from the BBC transmitter were hitting the metal skin of the bomber, bouncing off and being caught by Wilkins' simple antenna. It was crude, it was faint, but it was proof. They could see a plane miles away using nothing but invisible radio waves. Tizard had his answer. The death ray was dead. Radio direction finding, as they first called it, was born. We would come to know it by its American name, radar.
Now, this is where the story splits. In Germany, scientists were having similar ideas. In fact, a German inventor named Christian Hillsmeyer had patented a basic radar concept as early as 1904 to detect ships in the fog. But the German military in the 1930s was arrogant. They were focused on attack. Their new doctrine was the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Their resources went into bombers, into tanks, into dive bombers like the Stuka. Detection was seen as defensive, and defense was seen as weak. They had radar, yes, but it was low priority. They didn't see its true war-winning potential. The Nazis, and Hitler in particular, were obsessed with tangible, brutalist power. Massive guns, enormous tanks, giant battleships. The idea of winning a war with invisible waves, it felt, as they disgustingly termed it, like Jewish physics. It was the theoretical nonsense of men like Einstein, whom they had exiled. Their hubris was a strategic blunder of historic proportions. Back in Britain, Tizard had no such luxury. He had to be practical. He immediately took the Daventry Experiment to the government, and, in a rare moment of foresight, they listened. They gave him the money. Tizard and Watson Watt began a project of breathtaking scale. They didn't have time to invent tiny, perfect radar sets. They needed a system, and they needed it now. The result was Chain Home. If you drive along the southern and eastern coasts of England today, you can still see some of them. Giant 360-foot steel towers looking like relics of a forgotten age. In 1938, they were the most advanced defensive weapon on Earth. Chain Home wasn't elegant. It was brute force. Instead of sending a focused beam, the towers floodlit the entire English Channel with a powerful pulsing radio wave. The returning echoes were picked up by a second set of 240-foot wooden towers. It was clumsy. It wasn't very accurate. It couldn't see low-flying planes, and it couldn't tell you exactly how many planes were in a single formation. But it worked. And more importantly, Tizard knew the towers themselves were only half the solution. The other half was the human system designed to interpret the data. This was the Dowding system, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. This is what happened in 1940, during the Battle of Britain. A young woman, a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, would sit in a small hut, staring at a screen. She'd see the faint blips from the towers, she'd turn a dial, measure the echo, and make a quick calculation. Then she'd pick up a telephone. Her call would go to a central filter room. This place was a hive of activity. Dozens of women moving wooden blocks around a giant map of Great Britain. Each block represented an enemy formation. The women would get reports from multiple Chain Home stations, cross-reference them, and triangulate a position. They were filtering out the noise, creating a single, clear picture of the sky. That map, that main plot, was then relayed to the group headquarters, and from there, directly to the sector airfields where the Spitfires and Hurricanes were waiting. Now, picture this. It's August 1940. Hermann Göring, the chief of the Luftwaffe, launches Adlertag, Eagle Day. His plan is to crush the Royal Air Force. Hundreds of German bombers, escorted by fighters, swarm across the channel. They are confident. They believe they have surprise, numbers, and better planes. But when they arrive over Kent, they are shocked. The Spitfires are already there. They aren't on the ground refueling. They are diving out of the sun, exactly at the right altitude, in exactly the right place. Göring cannot understand it. His pilots are baffled. They report being met by perfectly positioned interceptors every single time. It feels like magic. It feels like the British can read their minds. Göring in his rage believes there must be spies, traitors in his own command feeding the British his plans. He was wrong. It wasn't spies. It was Henry Tizard's towers. It was the women in the filter rooms. It was the doubting system. The Germans were flying, arrogant and blind, into an invisible electronic net. Chainholm didn't win the Battle of Britain on its own. The courage of the pilots did that. But it gave the few a fighting chance. It turned their small numbers into a deadly, efficient scalpel. While this public battle was raging in the skies, the secret war was heating up. The Germans were not stupid. They knew the British had something, and they had their own electronic tricks.
This chapter of the Wizard War belongs to another hero, a brilliant and often overlooked physicist named Reginald V. Jones. R.V. Jones was, in many ways, Tizard's counterpart in scientific intelligence. He was young, just in his 20s, and had a mind that saw patterns no one else could. In 1939, just before the war, Jones received a mysterious package. It came from an anonymous source in Oslo, Norway, who claimed to be a sympathetic German scientist. It came to be known as the Oslo Report. It was a list of advanced German weapons research. Most of the British establishment dismissed it as a fake, a clever piece of German disinformation. But Jones read it, and he believed it. It listed new developments in rockets, in jet engines, and most curiously, in radio-guided bombing. This report became his Bible. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain ended, the Germans shifted tactics. They began bombing London and other cities at night. This was the Blitz, and their accuracy was terrifying. Bombs were landing night after night on specific factories, specific railway yards, specific docks, in the pitch black. How are they doing it? The answer was in the Oslo Report. The Germans had developed a system called Knickebein, or crooked leg. It was deceptively simple. They set up 2 radio transmitters on the French coast, both sending a tight, narrow beam. The beams were aimed to intersect directly over a target in England, say a Rolls-Royce factory in Derby. The German bomber would fly into one beam, hearing a steady stream of dots in his headphones. If he strayed too far left, he'd hear a dash. He just had to follow the dots. Then, when he flew into the second beam, a different tone would sound. That was the signal. Bombs away. It was devastatingly effective, but R.V. Jones, remembering the Oslo Report, was on the case. He tasked a pilot to fly a specially equipped plane searching for these mysterious beams, and he found them. Once Jones knew what they were, he devised a counter. It was the first great act of British electronic counter-warfare. He ordered new transmitters to be built that would broadcast the same dot signal as the German beam, but slightly off-key. The Germans called his system Headache. A German pilot, thinking he was on course, would be listening to Jones's false signal, which would slowly, gently bend him away from the target. Night after night, German bombs intended for factories in Coventry or Birmingham began falling harmlessly in open fields. The German pilots were confused. Their equipment said they were on target, but their reports said they missed. The Germans, realizing they'd been tricked, upgraded.
They built X-Garret and Y-Garret, more complex systems using multiple beams. Each time, R.V. Jones and his team, who were now nicknamed the Beam Benders, figured it out and deployed a new counter. They were fighting a war of wits, a war that no one in the public knew was happening. But Henry Tizard knew this defensive war wasn't enough. Britain was surviving, but it wasn't winning. The real problem was that Britain was running out of money, and it was still, essentially, alone. America was neutral, and many in Congress wanted to keep it that way. This is where Tizard faces his own battle, not against the Germans, but against a rival in Churchill's own government, Frederick Lindenman. Lindenman, also known as Lord Sherwell, was Churchill's personal scientific advisor. He and Tizard were bitter rivals. They were complete opposites. Tizard was a collaborator, a pragmatist. Lindenman was an autocrat, arrogant, and often fixated on his own pet projects, regardless of their practicality. They clashed over everything. Lindenman famously dismissed radar as unimportant and instead pushed for ridiculous projects like dropping aerial mines on bombers from planes dangling cables. Churchill, who had a soft spot for Lindenman's dramatic, often flawed ideas, sided with his friend. Tizard was effectively pushed out of his high-level position. It was a terrible blow. But Tizard, ever the patriot, knew what he had to do. He couldn't win the political fight in London, so he decided to bet everything on America. In the summer of 1940, with the Battle of Britain just beginning, Tizard organized what was, without question, the most important mission of the war, the Tizard Mission.
His plan was audacious. He would go to the neutral United States, a nation still wary of being dragged into Europe's war, and he would give them everything. He wasn't going to ask for help. He was going to offer a gift. He would give them all of Britain's most advanced, most secret military technology. The jet engine designs by Frank Whittle, plans for the proximity fuse, research on atomic weapons, and, most importantly, the secrets of radar. His hope was that by showing America what Britain had, America's own industrial and scientific might would be awakened. They would become, as Roosevelt would later say, the arsenal of democracy. It was an incredible gamble. In late August 1940, Tizard and a small team sailed for America. In their luggage, they carried a single locked deed box. It was known as the Black Box. Inside it were the crown jewels of British science. Tizard knew that if his ship was intercepted by a U-boat, a very real possibility in the Atlantic, he was to throw the box overboard. The future of the free world was in that box. He arrived in Washington in September. At first, the American military and scientific community was polite but skeptical. They had their own radar programs, after all. The U.S. Navy had a decent radar for ships. The Army was working on its own. They showed Tizard's team what they had. The British team was impressed by the engineering, but the technology itself was years behind. The American radars were bulky, operating on long 2-meter wavelengths, just like the original chain home. They were too big to fit in an airplane, at least not a small one. For days, the two sides exchanged pleasantries and discussed theory. The Americans were holding back, and so were the British. Then Tizard decided it was time. He brought his American counterparts into a room at the Wardman Park Hotel. He had them empty their pockets to prove no one was secretly recording. Then he opened the black box. He pulled out blueprints, research papers, and then he pulled out the thing itself. It was small, about the size of a dinner plate, and looked like a round copper block. It was number 12 of its kind, built by hand at Birmingham University. It was the cavity magnetron. The Americans stared at it. They didn't quite understand what they were looking at. One of the British scientists, Taffy Bowen, who had been instrumental in developing it, began to explain. The problem with all existing radar, he said, was that to get a precise, narrow beam, you needed a massive antenna. And to get high power, you needed a massive transmitter. But what if you could create enormous power at a tiny wavelength from a small device? The cavity magnetron did just that. It was essentially a new kind of vacuum tube, a high-powered whistle. It took the power of a giant chain-home transmitter and shrunk it into a box you could hold in your hands. It didn't operate on wavelengths of meters. It operated on wavelengths of centimeters. This was the Holy Grail. The Americans were stunned. One of the top American scientists, Alfred Loomis, a millionaire inventor, supposedly said, "This is the most important cargo that has ever been brought to our shores." They took the prototype to the Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey. They hooked it up. The American engineers, used to their own systems which produced maybe a few hundred watts, watched as the British magnetron pumped out 10,000 watts on a 10-centimeter beam. They thought their equipment was broken. They reran the test. It was true. It was a leap in technology not by 10%, but by a factor of 100, or as some said, 1,000. The Tizard mission changed everything overnight. The Americans, seeing what was possible, threw their full weight into the project. A new top-secret laboratory was established at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, or the RAD Lab. The British had given America the breakthrough. Now America would give the Allies the industrial power to win the war. And Henry Tizard, the man Churchill had sidelined, had, in one single mission, secured the future of the alliance. The first and most urgent problem to solve with this new microwave radar was the U-boat menace. In 1941 and 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. German U-boats, hunting in wolf packs, were sinking hundreds of Allied ships, strangling Britain. The problem was detection. A U-boat is a small target. The old long-wave radars couldn't pick them up. But the new 10-centimeter radar from the magnetron, its beam was so sharp it could pick up something as small as a submarine's periscope bobbing in the waves, even from a plane flying miles away. The new radar, dubbed H-2S, was installed in long-range bombers like the B-24 Liberator. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. U-boat crews, who had operated with total arrogance, were terrified. Allied planes were appearing out of the night sky, dropping depth charges with pinpoint accuracy. The U-boats had no warning. Their crude detectors were looking for the old long-wave radars. They couldn't even detect the new 10-centimeter waves. By 1943, the tide in the Atlantic had turned, thanks almost entirely to Tizard's magic box. But the Wizard War was escalating on another front, the bombing campaign against Germany. Bomber Command under Arthur Bomber Harris was tasked with destroying Germany's industrial heartland. But there was a dark secret. They were failing badly. A report in 1941, the Butt Report, showed that of all the crews who claimed to have hit their target, only 1/3 had gotten within 5 miles. They weren't bombing factories, they were bombing empty German countryside. The problem, again, was navigation. At night, over a blacked-out Germany, pilots were hopelessly lost. They needed a way to see the ground, through clouds, and in total darkness. Tizard's mission's magnetron was the answer. The MIT Radiation Lab and their British counterparts worked on a new version of H-2S. This one wouldn't look for ships, it would paint a map of the ground. The principle was beautiful in its simplicity. The 10-centimeter radar beam would scan the ground below the bomber. Different surfaces returned different echoes. Water, like rivers and lakes, absorbed the waves and appeared as black. Open country scattered the waves and appeared as a faint gray. But cities?
Cities, with their dense collection of right-angled buildings, bounced the waves back hard. They glowed on the screen as a bright, unmistakable patch. For the first time, a bomber crew flying at 20,000 feet in thick cloud could look at a screen and see the city of Berlin, the curve of the River Spree, the dark patch of the Tiergarten Park. They could navigate with an accuracy that was, just months before, considered impossible.
This brings us to one of the most controversial and terrible episodes of the war, the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943, Operation Gomorrah. The Germans, by now, were catching on. After an H-2S-equipped bomber crashed near Rotterdam, they recovered the Rotterdam Gerät, their name for the magnetron. Their scientists were shocked. They couldn't believe the Allies had mass-produced such a device. They hadn't thought it was possible, that old arrogance again. They quickly built a detector for it, codenamed Naxos. German night fighters were now being guided by the H-2S signals from the British bombers. So, R.V. Jones and his team had to counter the counter, and their solution was, once again, brilliantly simple. It was codenamed Window. Today we call it chaff. It was just strips of aluminum foil cut to the precise length of the German radar's wavelength. Dropped from a plane, these millions of strips would float in the air, creating a massive false echo. To a German radar operator, a single bomber dropping a bundle of window looked like an entire squadron of 800 planes. On the night of Hamburg's raid, the lead bombers dropped window. The entire German air defense system collapsed. Their radar screens were blinded by a blizzard of snow. Their anti-aircraft guns fired wildly at phantom targets. Their night fighters, guided by radar, were vectored off to chase clouds of tinfoil. Into this chaos, the main bomber stream flew, virtually untouched. The result was the complete destruction of the city and a firestorm that killed over 40,000 people. It was a horrifying, brutal moment, but it was a total victory for electronic warfare. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the side that controlled the electromagnetic spectrum would win the war. The Germans, reeling from Hamburg, were forced to adapt, and fast. They abandoned their now useless radar systems and rushed new ones into production. They developed Liechtenstein SN2, a new radar that operated on a different frequency, one that window didn't affect as much. They put it in their Me-110 night fighters. And it worked. Suddenly, the tables turned again. In the winter of 1943-44, Bomber Command launched the Battle of Berlin. It was a disaster. The new German radar, combined with brilliant night fighter tactics, tore the British bombers to shreds. The Wizard War was a constant, brutal seesaw. But by 1944, a new and far more terrifying threat was emerging. It was the weapon that Hitler believed would be his salvation, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, or Swallow. It's hard to overstate what a shock this weapon was. Imagine you're a 20-year-old farm boy from Ohio flying a B-17 Flying Fortress over Germany. You're cold, you're terrified, and you're flying a big, slow, lumbering target. Your plane's top speed is maybe 280 miles per hour. The P-51 Mustangs protecting you can hit 440 if they push it. Then, something appears in the sky. It's not a plane, not really. It's a speck that becomes a monster in seconds. It has no propellers. It moves with a terrifying, smooth howl. It's the Me-262 Schwalbe, or Swallow. Its top speed is nearly 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies have. It flashes through your bomber formation, its 430mm cannons firing. A B-17 disintegrates in a single pass. And then, before your gunners can even draw a bead, the jet is gone, climbing back into the sun, untouchable. This was the crisis of 1944. The Me-262 was, on paper, an invincible weapon. It was too fast to intercept, it flew too high, it hit too hard. Allied bomber losses skyrocketed. A sense of panic began to set in at Allied high command. All the hard-won air superiority was threatening to evaporate. And the original radar system, Tizard's beloved chain home, was now almost useless. Think about the system. A blip appears. A woman in a hut measures it. She phones a filter room. A plotter moves a wooden block. The information is relayed. This takes perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. A Spitfire in that time might move 5 or 10 miles, but an Me-262? In 2 minutes, it could be 18 miles further. By the time the Allied fighters were scrambled to the intercept point, the Me-262 was already back at its base, rearming. The entire dowding system, the very thing that had saved Britain, was now obsolete. The Germans, though they didn't fully realize it, finally had a weapon that was faster than the Wizard War. But they didn't, because the Wizard War had not stood still. Remember the Tizard mission? Remember that little copper box, the cavity magnetron? While Chain Home was busy winning the Battle of Britain and H2S was map-making over Germany, the scientists at the MIT Rad Lab had been working on Tizard's original ultimate goal. They weren't just thinking about big ground-based systems, they were thinking small. They wanted to take the new 10-centimeter microwave radar, the one that the Germans still couldn't detect properly, and make it small enough to fit into the nose of a night fighter. This was the Tizard jet radar prototype from the title. It was the direct technological descendant of the magnetron Tizard carried in his black box. The Americans developed the SCR-720, a magnificent compact radar set. The British developed their own, AI Mark 8. These sets were installed in specialized night fighters, the American P-61 Black Widow and the fast, wooden British Mosquito. These planes were the perfect counterweapon. They were fast, especially the Mosquito, and now they could see in the dark with a precision the Germans couldn't even imagine. And here is the final, beautiful piece of Nazi hubris. The Germans knew about centimeter microwave radar. They had the Rotterdam Gerät. But their top scientists, blinded by their old doctrines, had concluded it was too complex, too finicky to be mass-produced or made reliable enough to put in a bouncing, vibrating airplane. They were convinced the Allies were still fumbling with the same long-wave, metrical radar that they were.
So, their night fighters were equipped with detectors like Naxos and Flensburg, which were only designed to listen for the old Allied radar. They were completely, totally deaf to the new 10-centimeter beams. Now, let's put all the pieces together for the final scene. It's late 1944. A German airfield. An Me-262 jet pilot, one of Germany's elite, climbs into his cockpit. He's confident. He's flying an Uber machine. He takes off into the dusk, part of a wolf pack heading for the Allied bomber stream. He checks his instruments. His Naxos detector is silent. The sky is empty. He is the hunter. But miles away, a British Mosquito night fighter, painted matte black, is loitering in the dark. The pilot can't see a thing, but his radar operator sitting beside him is staring at a small, green, hooded screen. Suddenly, a blip appears, sharp, clear, 10 miles, closing fast. "Contact, bogey, 10 miles, Angels 20. He murmurs into the intercom. The Mosquito pilot nods. He banks his plane not towards the blip, but to a point ahead of it, an intercept course. In the Me-262, the German pilot is still serene. His detectors are silent. He sees nothing. He has no idea that a 10-centimeter beam of pure, focused energy is bouncing off his fuselage, feeding his exact position, speed, and altitude to an enemy he cannot see. The range closes. 8 miles, 5 miles. "Should be getting a visual soon," the radar operator says. The Mosquito pilot strains his eyes in the dark. "Tally-ho, I have 'em. Starboard, slightly above." There it is. A dark, shark-like shadow against the slightly lighter sky. The Mosquito, a plane made of wood, slides in behind the most advanced jet in the world. The German pilot is oblivious. He's still looking ahead for the bombers, never dreaming that death is coming from behind. The Mosquito pilot gets him in his sights. He's not aiming for the plane. He's aiming for the small spot just in front of it. He squeezes the trigger.
4 20mm cannons erupt. The shells tear into the Me-262's engine and fuselage. The invincible jet doesn't even have time to react. It explodes in a bright orange fireball, scattering debris across the night sky. The Mosquito pilot banks away. Target destroyed. Returning to base. Back at German High Command, the reports are baffling. Their top aces, their Experten, are being lost. At night, in clear weather, with no warning. They blame pilot error. They blame faulty engines. They execute men for suspected treason. They never suspect the truth, that their enemies were wielding an invisible weapon they themselves had deemed impossible. The Me-262 should have won the air war, but it was defeated not by a faster plane, but by an earlier warning. It was defeated by a box of electronics, born from a single practical question Henry Tizard had asked 10 years earlier. The Nazi regime, built on an ideology of brutal, tangible strength, was defeated by an idea, by the very Jewish physics they so despised. Tizard, a man they had never even heard of, had effectively checkmated them from a decade away. The war, as we know, ended in 1945. The Wizard War was over. But its impact was just beginning. When we look at our world today, we are living in the world that Henry Tizard and that cavity magnetron built. That little copper box, designed to hunt U-boats, didn't just win the war. It was the start of the entire electronics revolution. After the war, the MIT Rad Lab scientists fanned out across America, founding new companies, starting new fields of research. The magnetron itself? Well, an engineer at Raytheon, Percy Spencer, was standing next to one. He noticed a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. He had a flash of insight. Today, we call that insight a microwave oven. The technology shrunk further, got more advanced. It led to better air traffic control, saving millions of lives. It led to satellite communications. It led to the very networks that allow you to watch this video right now. The story of Tizard and the Me-262 is more than just a piece of history. It's a profound lesson in a world that is still very much in a wizard war. It's a lesson about arrogance. The Nazi regime's greatest weakness was its inability to question its own superiority. They mocked what they didn't understand, and that mockery was a fatal blind spot. It's also a lesson in quiet persistence. Henry Tizard was not a showman. He was pushed aside, he lost political battles, but he never lost sight of the real problem. He was a man of deep character and integrity who put his country's survival above his own ego. And finally, it's a lesson in the power of generosity. Tizard's decision to give America his most precious secrets, with no strings attached, was an act of profound trust. It was the opposite of the Nazi hubris. It was an admission that we cannot do this alone. And that single act of collaboration, of shared genius, is what ultimately turned the tide and built the modern world we live in. The soldiers and pilots of the greatest generation were the brave sword and shield, but the wizards like Tizard, Watson Watt, and R.V. Jones, they were the ones who gave them the magic, unstoppable edge. We find that stories like this about the hidden heroes of history are the ones that stick with us the most. If you feel the same, you might consider subscribing to our channel. We're dedicated to digging up these incredible, often overlooked moments that shaped our world. This topic is, of course, massive. The Wizard War filled entire libraries, and we've only scratched the surface of the Battle of the Beams, the development of Window, and the incredible cat-and-mouse game R.V. Jones played with the German scientists. Many viewers tell us that the best part of these histories is finding the next story. If you'd like to continue exploring this, the video we've queued up next on the screen deals with the Rotterdam Gericht and the German side of the race for radar. It's a perfect companion to this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and for helping us keep these vital stories alive. Stay with us to keep